Go.
Hi, I'm Cheryl Lazarus, and I'm the director of the National Center on Educational Outcomes, NCEO. In this session, I'll be presenting with Andrew Hinkle, who is an education program manager at NCEO, and Trinell Bowman, who is the associate superintendent of special education at Prince George's Public Schools in Maryland. This session will explore how to use interim assessments to validly measure what students with disabilities know and can do. There is increasing interest in states in the possible use of interim assessment data to measure the grade level standards-based progress of students. This includes an interest in measuring learning loss or possible gaps in achievement that may have resulted because of COVID-19 school closures and inconsistent distance learning. This interest is especially prevalent among states that are using some form of interim assessments to measure progress as part of the results-driven accountability systems, state systemic improvement plans, the SIPs. Next, Andrew Hinkle will tell you a little about interim assessments and takeaways from an interim assessment advisory panel meeting that NCEO held. Andrew?
Hi, I'm Andrew Hinkle. Before we discuss interim assessments, it would be helpful if we share with you the definition of interim assessments that we are using. Interim assessments refer to assessments that are administered several times during a school year to measure progress. Other terms that are sometimes used to describe these assessments are local assessments and formative assessments. When we say formative assessment in this definition, I want to be clear that we do not mean the formative assessment practices employed by teachers and students during instruction to obtain feedback that is used to adjust instruction to improve student learning. The formative assessments in this definition is just an alternate term for interim assessments that we sometimes encounter. As Cheryl mentioned, there is increasing interest in states in the possible use of interim assessment data for a number of purposes. For example, to measure the grade level standards-based progress of students, for instructional decision-making. There's recent interest in measuring learning loss or possible gaps in achievement that may have resulted because of COVID-19 school closures and inconsistent distance learning. Interim assessment data may be useful in helping guide learning recovery and acceleration of learning efforts. There are a number of states that are using interim assessments to measure progress as part of their SIPs, and some states suggested using interim assessments during the pandemic as part of their ESSA accountability system. And finally, we see some states using interim assessments as part of a third grade reading guarantee type program. Because of the ongoing and growing interest in using interim assessments for a variety of purposes, NCEO decided to embark on a set of activities with the purpose of developing and disseminating guidance on how to enable the participation of all students with disabilities, including English learners with disabilities, in interim assessments in ways that support obtaining valid results of what they know and can do. The first activity was to hold an advisory panel meeting. After the meeting, we published the takeaways and recommendations that came from the advisory panel. And then on July 26th and 27th, we will be holding a national convening for states. The purpose of the convening will be for state education agencies to identify opportunities and challenges on how to enable all students with disabilities, including students with the most significant cognitive disabilities and English learners with disabilities, to participate in interim assessments in ways that yield valid inferences of what they know and can do at both the state and local education agency levels, and outline a set of goals or action steps based on the opportunities and challenges identified that states can start to address after the convening. A quick overview of the advisory panel meeting is that we brought together a 15-member panel of national experts with expertise in students with disabilities and English learners with disabilities. They came from a wide range of backgrounds, including psychometric experts, state and local education agency staff, parent representatives, and researchers. The meeting was held virtually for 2 days in February. Prior to the meeting, we gave them some materials to review, including a draft report on the landscape of interim assessment use across states and information about SIPs and SIMMers. Then, during the meeting, the advisors noted concerns and gaps about current interim assessments and their uses, suggested what should be, and proposed practical considerations for a better interim assessment system for each of 5 areas: participation, accessibility, the role of academic standards, technical issues, and data use, interpretation, and reporting. After the meeting, NCEO compiled the information and wrote this report, using interim assessments to appropriately measure what students with disabilities know and can do, advisory panel takeaways, and NCEO recommendation. This is report number 427, and you can access it on the NCEO website in the publications section. In this report, NCEO published 7 recommendations. The first is to obtain data on the participation of students with disabilities in interim assessments and develop a plan for analyzing those data. It is essential to examine participation rates and discuss these in ways that inform decision-making. Next is to provide high-quality interim assessments for students with the most significant cognitive disability. For alternate interim assessments to be worthy of administering, it is vital that they are high-quality assessments that measure what they are intended to measure, provide meaningful and useful data, and are engaging to the student. The next one is to provide a wide range of accessibility features and accommodations, including accommodations for students with sensory disabilities, for example, Braille graphic organizers or sign language interpretation, etc., and English learners with disabilities, for example, glossaries and translations. Students with disabilities, including those with sensory disabilities and English learners with disabilities, need to be able to access interim assessments in ways that allow them to meaningfully show what they know and can do. Recommendation 4 is to provide guidance on the provision of accessibility and accommodation. State education agencies and local education agencies need to engage with vendors to develop guidance and policies on accessibility and accommodation. The next recommendation is to provide transparency on the degree of alignment or lack of alignment to grade level academic content standards of both general and alternate interim assessment. Documentation of the alignment of the assessment to grade level academic content standards should be publicly provided. Requests for proposals and requests for information should require vendors to show how general and alternate interim assessments map onto a state's grade level academic content standards. Recommendation 6 is to provide documentation and evidence that interim assessments are properly designed to evoke the intended cognitive processes when administered to students with disabilities. Documentation and validity evidence, for example, think alouds or cognitive labs, should be provided to confirm that students with disabilities are demonstrating the assessment's intended cognitive processes. And the final recommendation is to provide publicly available guidance on the appropriate and inappropriate uses of data in formats that meet the need of intended audiences. Guides and reports that are created should consider the need of intended audiences, for example, district and school leaders, teachers, policymakers, parents, and families, appropriate and inappropriate purposes and use of data from each interim assessment should be publicly documented. Another resource that came out of the advisory panel meeting is this one on interim assessment practices for students with disabilities. This brief, number 22, can also be accessed on the NCEO website. This is the final version of the overview of the interim assessment landscape that we originally gave to the panel members prior to the And the third and final resource that was born from the advisory panel meeting is this one, brief number 23, alternate interim assessments for students with the most significant cognitive disabilities. There was a lot of discussion by the panel members about alternate interim assessments. The IDEA requires that when there is a state or local assessment that all students take, then there must be an alternate assessment. We found that this is often not the case when it comes to interim assessments, so we felt it was important to address this topic in its own publication. This brief, developed with Diane Browder, offers preliminary guidance for the development of interim assessment options for students with the most significant cognitive disabilities. If you are interested in learning more about interim alternate assessments, Dr. Lazarus and Dr. Browder have a post-it presentation you can check out. Now I'm going to turn this over to Trinell Bowman. Trinell?
Hello, I'm Trinell Bowman. I'm going to give you a district highlight from Prince George's County Public Schools here in Maryland. In Prince George's County Public Schools, beginning in the fall of 2020, students who participate in the general assessments began to take a new benchmark assessment. This new benchmark assessment is administered in reading and English language arts and mathematics for students in grades 3 through 10. The purpose of these assessments is to provide instructional data by domain and standard at the item level with statistics for teachers to see what students have learned during the reading, English language arts, and mathematics classroom instruction activities. The benchmark assessments in Prince George's County Public Schools were administered 3 times during the school year to gauge student performance. Benchmark assessments for students with disabilities were used to determine several different data points and data sources that again can contribute to the overall determination of a student's present levels of functional performance when we think about the development of IEP goals and objectives. Students with the most significant cognitive disabilities were also administered interim benchmark assessments this school year, each quarter via the Unique Learning Systems platform. The students were administered benchmarks in the areas of reading, writing, mathematics, transition, and emergent skills. These data sources allow IEP teams to collect IEP progress data to determine if the student is on track for mastery, and again, at the end of the IEP cycle to measure and report growth. When we think about the challenges of our interim assessments in Prince George's County Public Schools, we know that many students made significant progress, and that overall, when we think about our students with disabilities, we continue to make progress in terms of their participation in our various interim assessments. We would like to go through a few challenges from a school and assessment perspective. One of the challenges for our school's perspective is when we think about our students with visual impairments prefer to take the assessment online rather than using hard copy, braille, or large print. Due to the nature of the assessment, some students had to administer paper products versus the online, and many of our students reported that they would have preferred to take the assessment online. Another challenge for our students is that their parents or caregivers had to administer the assessment because we were administering it during remote learning. Sometimes providing the administration by parents or caregivers does not provide an accurate picture of the student's level of performance, just because sometimes the parents overly prompt the student or provide support that is not documented in their individualized education programs. From an assessment perspective, in terms of challenges that were encountered, is that some of the components of the development of the assessment or items for the platform did not meet all of our accessibility standards. For example, there were some items in the bank that relied on color, which did not allow students with color blindness or vision impairments to answer the question. One accessibility factor of color reliance that we always show when we're reading or looking at items is if you print the item on black and white, will the student be able to still answer the question? In a couple of cases, we found that those accessibility standards, for example, were not followed. Another factor that we encountered around accessibility was the use of the different shades of grayscale, which were always not accessible for students who had low vision. We also encountered, just because of students being in different home environments with different bandwidth issues, we did encounter some concerns related to bandwidth requirements, particularly for those students who were using the text and graphic forms. The text and graphic speech-to-text forms meant that every item is read to the student and all graphics were described, which increases the bandwidth of the test forms. The last challenge that we encountered is that students who took our alternate assessments for benchmarks did not have full access to the full depth and breadth of the standards. And that is something that we're definitely working on as we move forward for next school year. When we think about our lessons learned for the interim assessments, we're very excited to report that students were definitely able to use accessible calculators through Dismos with the platform, particularly for our mathematic assessment. So students who are blind or have vision impairments were able to use Desmos, which gives them access to a graphing calculator that's implemented as a web application and a mobile application that is written in JavaScript, which makes the calculator very accessible. The other thing that we are excited for is that our students taking the assessment in grades K through 2 were really able to access the platform with little or no assistance. We also are happy to report that staff and teachers were able to get the assessment reporting results very quickly to really gauge and equip teachers to inform instruction for our students and to make those adjustments. And then there was flexibility with our test administration was key and to providing equitable access that students not only at home were able to take the assessment, but we were also able to deliver hard copy test materials to students home to support the administration of the assessment remotely. And thank you for letting me share Prince George's County's perspective on interim assessments. And now I'll turn it over to Dr. Cheryl Lattiser, who will provide us with some summaries and discussion points.
You're muted. Cheryl, you need to unmute your mic.
Oh, I apologize. I have it unmuted now. Just a second and I will get going. Thank you, Janelle. Many states and districts use interim assessments and more are considering using them. Trinell's presentation shows how one district is using interim assessments and how that district is including students with disabilities in them. The interim assessment takeaways and NCEO recommendations can provide preliminary guidance on how to validly measure what students with disabilities know and can do. I wish that we were all in the same room right now and could have a lively discussion. But in any case, you may want to consider several questions. The first question you may want to consider is, what has worked well when including students with disabilities in interim assessments, and what are the challenges? Another question you may want to consider are, how are the needs of students with disabilities considered during the interim assessment design process? For additional information about how to validly measure what students with disabilities know and can do, visit the NCEO website. You can also send an email to any of us if you have questions or would like additional information. We have enjoyed sharing a little about interim assessments with you. Thank you for visiting this session.